Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Pillars WX wash processed Panama from Coffea Circulor. And there's the bag right there. And Coffea Circulor, based out of Gothenburg, Sweden. And this is part 3 of our 4-part series featuring Coffea Circulor's Nebula Constellation set, and yet another Panamanian Gesture review from Coffea Circulor, as we've reviewed a number of them this year up to this point, and that shouldn't come as too much of a surprise given that I am a big fan of wash processed Panamanian Geshas, especially from Coffea Circulor, as they've been some of my favorite coffees over the last couple of years. So when I saw that this one was also included in this Constellation set, it also definitely piqued my interest, and I'll be looking forward to reviewing yet another Panamanian Gesha from Coffea Circulor, as this right here is day 37. And recipe we went with for this coffee was Coffea Circulor's recipe at a 15:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 95 degrees Celsius, about 203 degrees Fahrenheit. And I liked this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, once again, it's been on par with the last 2 coffees that we've reviewed from Coffea Circulor, which definitely continues to trend on the lighter side of things. And I do want to say that it's not necessarily the ultra light or super light coffees, but it's still on the very light side of things, as they are a very light roasting coffee roaster. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 18, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and interestingly enough, there was a relatively strong aroma that's not overly typical for a wash processed coffee, as the cup itself yields a more soft citric forward profile in line with the expectations of a Panamanian Gesha. Outside of that, there was a slight citric bitterness, but for the most part, an interestingly tame start, as I felt like maybe this coffee needed a bit more time. We move on to day 21 as we opted for the Chemex, and similar results, as once again it did have a very strong aroma that was near natural levels, but the cup itself continued to yield a little bit more of a softer citric profile to it, with a slight brown candied aspect to complement a little bit more of an herbal citric quality that was present within the cup. A soft citric bloom attribute is kind of the best way I could describe it, like a citric floral bloom component to it. Opens up as it does cool down with a little bit more sweetness and intensity to it. But for the most part, it's been a little atypical of not just Panamanian Geshas in general, but a lot of the coffees that we have had from Coffea Circulor in this field. We move on to day 24 as we opted for the April Brewer, and the cup had the most intensity that it's had up to this point, as it cooled down into much more of the tropical intense cup, with a little bit more of what I would describe as a passion fruit in the finish itself. A bit more of a citric brightness throughout, as it's even offering a candied sweetness to complement the citric aspects to it, so it does have plenty of depth. There's a lot to pick up from this coffee, but once again, it's just a little bit more heavy, a little bit more intense, and lacking some of the clarity and cleanliness I would have expected for a coffee like this. Day 27 opted for the V60 with Coffea Circulor's recipe, and it did have a little bit more clarity to this point, with the base offering a better defined citric aspect to it. Very tropical cup yet again though, with plenty of the papaya and passion fruit, and typically when I experience that intense of a tropicality, it doesn't necessarily lend itself towards the cleanest profile to the coffee, and that was no exception with this one, as I felt this one wasn't maybe to the standard and expectation I would have for a wash processed Panamanian Gesha. More of the slight brown candied aspect yet again, with a lime-like quality within the finish itself in a lingering sense, with the structure of the coffee continuing to improve. We move on to day 30 as we opted for the Chemex with Coffea Circulor's recipe, and this one felt a fair bit more layered off brew, as there's plenty of that tropical fruit aspect yet again, with the passion fruit and papaya still dominating the cup. After a cool down, there's a little bit more of a stone fruit aspect in a sweeter sense, complemented by the well-defined lime-like quality. So I'm noticing this coffee really seeming to structure itself very well. Layered, great depth, plenty to it. More of the, what I would describe as almost caramel candy-like finish to the cup too. So lots to pick up from this one. That's the positive benefits of Panamanian Geshas in general. Day 33, final notes that we do have through the V60 with Coffea Circulor's recipe, and the coffee is the best it has been up to this point by a fair bit, interestingly, as it continues to offer the tropical aspects in a much more evened out sense, cleaner, more citric forward profile in line with the listed orange and bergamot. And when I saw that there was a bergamot note listed on here, I said, okay, this coffee is probably going to taste like so many of the Coffea Circulor coffees that we've had in the past. It has that spiced citric quality to it. So this one didn't really seem to have that in as much abundance as I might have expected going into it. Honestly, Going into this coffee, I expected it to have just a very clean base to it and then offer that kind of lingering spiced citric quality that I've associated with so many of Coffea Circular's coffees, but not necessarily, as outside of that, it had an interestingly notable and pronounced brown candy quality that was very much in line with the listed toffee, but definitely the best day we'd experienced up to this point. All right, so let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have 4 level 4s, so let's go through those. And we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. And we're starting with the most important aspect of this coffee, because when it comes to Panamanian geishas, if they're a wash processed one, then I expect and want them to score that level 5 mark. But I said right from the start and throughout this review that it offered much more of a tropical intensity that was a little bit more reminiscent and in line with natural processed coffees. And while there was great structure and definition to it, I said this isn't quite to the same extent as even some of the Panamanian geishas we've reviewed from Coffea Circulor this year in general. So I feel like it would be too much to bump it all the way up to level 5. And even then, the level 4 isn't even necessarily quite to the same extent as what we experienced from the Peruvian geisha, the Orion WX. So it's clean, but maybe not to the extent or level that I was looking for or expecting. Finish, level 4. And once again, it came out in a little bit more interesting of a direction, as it had that listed toffee-like aspect to it. And having a brown candy finish for a Panamanian geisha is just interesting in general. So I found that to be a little bit more of a unique attribute within this coffee. Not one that I'm necessarily complaining about, as it started out maybe a little bit more in a direction that I didn't like with that tropical profile to it, but it finished much more in the direction that I do typically want for just any coffee in general, a sweeter finish to it. And that one leads us into the sweetness scoring there at that level 4 mark. And that can be found in a number of factors, most specifically the tropical fruit sweetness, which is never necessarily my favorite. I can't think of any of the tropical fruits that have really wowed me or impressed me to the point where I really want that to be the lead attribute of any coffee, let alone a Panamanian geisha. So having that score there at the level 4 is interesting. It came in a number of other directions as well, that toffee-like sweetness to it. So plenty to pick out from it in that sense. Level 4 does seem like the best place to put it. We move on to the citrus fruit at the level 4 mark. And I feel like that can come in a number of directions. As I mentioned, that there's like a tropical citric quality to it. There's also a lime-like quality to it. There's a lot of citric qualities within this coffee. So that definitely deserves to be the most notable and pronounced quality within this tasting wheel. As you can feel a little bit of the other things, passion fruit honestly goes a little bit more in line with that berry fruit quality. And I even mentioned that we were experiencing a fair bit of a more sugary and at times cleaner stone fruit quality to it. And even though those at times could have been a little bit more pronounced, I couldn't put them on par with the citric fruit quality, because that came in a number of different directions and was the most pronounced of the fruit profiles within this one. So that's why those are there at that level 3, and the citric quality is there at that level 4 mark. And then a couple of level 3s. We'll start with the acidity level 3. Once again, we're still working with a lower side of the acidity for a Coffea Circulor coffee, as I didn't necessarily find this to be the brightest, though this one was, I would say, pretty well defined as far as the acidity goes, as this one was very citric in terms of that brightness. So can definitely feel a little bit of that, though kind of waffling between a level 3 and a level 4. I still had to say that this one isn't necessarily as bright as the coffees we typically score at that level 4 mark, and that can be a number of factors, but level 3 felt the best place to put that. Florality level 3. That is another surprising component of this coffee, given that it is a Panamanian geisha and it's not completely acting like a Panamanian geisha in a number of ways. Florality was another one, as I felt like there was a little bit more of a generic citric floral component to it, as I mentioned that briefly, like a citric floral bloom sort of quality to it. That's the only thing I could really get in terms of that floral aspect. And then the final thing worth discussing as far as level 3 goes, which is that caramel. And I said, interestingly, plenty of that toffee-like attributes to it. I even considered bumping it up all the way to that level 4, though it was mostly felt in a cool down and in the finish itself. So I said level 3 probably is the better place for that. Final thing worth discussing in this tasting wheel overall, though, is the body at a level 2, and that's the third coffee from the set that still seems to score on the lower side of the body. That's a little bit more expected, given that this is a washed Panamanian geisha. Once again, they've all kind of been pretty even in terms of the overall body of it, not necessarily the most amount of texture to it. And you could have possibly expected this one to score even lower, given that at times Panamanian geishas can be tea-like. And if this tasting wheel is an indication of anything, that's that this coffee wasn't necessarily in line with what you might expect from a Panamanian geisha, but I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I think it's pretty well documented at this point that I want my washed Panamanian geishas to act like washed Panamanian geishas, because that is probably my all-time favorite coffee still, even with Mejorados. I think I've just had such a long and extensive history with Panamanian geishas, washed Panamanian geishas, that I always want them to turn out very reminiscent of the expectations that you do have for washed Panamanian geishas. So given that this one didn't offer the clarity, the florality, or even the body that you might necessarily expect for these type of coffees, I think those things are always going to kind of hold it back from being one of the more enjoyable Panamanian geishas I've had this year. Obviously, there are a number that we've reviewed this year, and I would say that I like this more than some of the other ones we've had, and definitely less than some of the other ones we've discussed as well. So it's kind of somewhere in that middle ground, but I still think there were some nice positives to it. I felt that it was a little bit more unique, especially given that it offered that brown candied sweetness, that toffee-like aspect to it. And in addition to that, there was plenty of depth, as I'm still experiencing a number of different fruit qualities to it, and plenty of sweetness, especially in that tropical sense. So definitely a fair bit of positives to pick up from this one, which does transition into the type of person I would suggest this coffee to. If Panamanian geishas are maybe a little bit too delicate and soft for you, and you don't necessarily enjoy the floral aspects of them, and you do tend to enjoy maybe some more intense coffees, but still like the, we'll say, other Panamanian geisha qualities, so the citric profile to it, still a lighter body, and still some great definition to the cup, maybe a little bit more in terms of the tropical fruit sense, then I feel like this one's a really nice fit for you, as it offered a number of those factors in addition to a little bit of a unique aspect in that toffee-like component to it. So kind of couple those things together, it's the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Pillars WX, wash processed Panama from Coffea Circulor. Thank you for watching.